Hello and welcome back once again to the HR Social Hour Half Hour Podcast. This is episode 221. John and Paul talk HR and pro wrestling. I'm your host, John.
And I'm Paul. John, how's it going?
Paul, I'm well. You're not Wendy.
No, I'm not. No one is Wendy except Wendy.
That is indeed the case. Welcome back. I'm very, very excited to have you with me today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
I think before we get too far, Paul, we're in the month of May and we're being sponsored by our friends over at Namely for the entire month. Do want to acknowledge them for sponsoring this episode. And Wendy and I have been really fortunate to work with Namely for some time now. And I don't know how much you've followed their path over the last many years. They're really good people. And it's really exciting to see that they're being recognized in the HR community, the HR tech community for some of the things that they've done. Recently, they won a Stevie Award for Business Excellence, and then also a 2022 Excellence in Customer Service Award. We love Namely. You've heard the show enough to know that. It's nice that people that we work with are being recognized by their peers and by the industry for the good that they're doing. Thanks, Namely. We're glad you're with us. Congratulations on those opportunities that you've had. Now, probably wondering, what is Paul doing here? Where's Wendy? Those of you who listen to the show for a long time, sometimes we have run into technical difficulties. Things don't work. Technology is great till it's not, Paul. Would you agree? I mean, that's kind of how life works.
That's actually one of my mottos that I talk to a lot about with my staff.
We had some recording issues over the last many weeks. And then unfortunately, Wendy's had some family commitments that have kept her away from home. So I was thinking about it, and then we talked about, do we do a clip show? And I said, no, I don't want to do a clip show. Those are good, but that's not us. And honestly, Paul, you may not know this. Of course, I've done all the editing all these years. I don't keep bloopers, so I couldn't do a blooper reel. I was thinking about the fact that I haven't talked to you in a little bit, and we also both appreciate professional wrestling very much. So we're going to have a conversation a little bit about you, and we're going to talk about HR and professional wrestling, but not necessarily HR in professional wrestling. We'll see.
Yeah, maybe not together. I think there's some overlaps maybe, but you have to wait and find out and see where we kind of go with this. But I was super excited when you reached out to me and said, hey, let's talk about this. I was like, yes, let's do it.
We're going to talk about you a little bit first. Can't get started without asking. We'll let everybody know we're kind of recording off cycle. It's a daytime record for us. Paul, what's in your glass?
I love this question. It's the greatest question of all time, but I'm drinking a tall boy of Liquid Death Mango Chainsaw. For those unfamiliar, it's just flavored water that's designed to murder your thirst and destroy plastic waste. So there's a little plug for Liquid Death.
Maybe we can get you hooked up with Liquid Death like we did Tracy Spanenberg with Spindrift, you know? I see that. They have that, she's a Spinfluencer, you could be a Liquid Death dealer. I kind of like that. I'm gonna try to take that one.
Okay, yeah, let's do it. We'll figure it out, man.
Paul, you've been on the show a few times as a guest. Most recently, and this is hard to believe, it's episode 123, which was July of 2020. What have you been up to since then?
Yeah, it's when you said that date, I was like, oh my God, already? It's kind of, time just flies. And I remember that recording like it was the other day. A month after that recording, my wife and I had our second child, Kian. I have officially founded my side gig consulting business since then, HR Logic LLC. So I get to add the LLC to it now, and it sounds more authentic, I guess. I've done a lot of virtual speaking engagements, sprinkled in with some live ones. One of the ones I absolutely was mind-blowing to me was I did Disrupt HR in St. Louis. Oh, wow. Jennifer McClure and Lori Rudiman were both there, and having them cheer me on in the audience was just kind of like, what has happened in my life that this is now part of my life. But another in-person event that I was really, really proud of was part of the inaugural social media team with Jeff Pukowski and Mary Williams at the Wisconsin State SHRM. So they were trying to mimic, and I thought very successfully, some of the social media stuff that bigger conferences do. We were there plugging it, and I've won a few awards I was really proud of, especially the HR Unite Award. Tina Marie out of HR Unite in Michigan. That was just mind-blowing that even happened, and I got that recognition. So just a lot of craziness.
It's all very positive craziness, and new additions to the family and opportunities to do different things. I think one of the exciting things that I got to see for you in that period of time since you were last on is you were promoted to the Vice President of People and Culture within your organization. Maybe you can remind folks a little bit about what that group does. Talk about that shift in mindset from HR to people and culture, and what would you tell others that are attempting to take that next step, not only with increased duties, but maybe shifting that mindset?
I'm glad you asked, because that's something I'm incredibly proud of. I work for the Community and Economic Development Association in Chicago. We do social service work for low-income individuals and try and help them out of poverty. The switch from HR to people and culture is just the continued evolution of where we're going. You know, words matter because they hold us accountable for our actions. That's just kind of my philosophy. I start a lot of my presentations with, why is HR so evil? And I have a slide deck up there with like Dilbert and all these memes making fun of HR. And it's meant to break the ice and do. But to me, I was inspired really by Lars Schmidt's Redefining HR. I'm not sure if you've read it or have seen it, or how many people in the audience have, but it's must read for any HR professional. After I read his book, he was really talking about a lot of things I was feeling, but I just couldn't really put it into words. So I used his book as a springboard to convince the CEO that this is the right direction we needed to go to continue to repair the HR department after years of challenges. You know, I would advise anyone that, again, even though words matter, it's not enough. You really have to back it up to really change the perception of HR, to move from what Lars called legacy human resources to modern human resources. You have to change your mindset. So HR can't be just compliance driven, just not bureaucratic forms and being the no police. You have to really shift to being a department of innovation, supporting people, and getting to yes, unless it's dumb or illegal, right? So I think the people puts that front and center. So it was just a culmination of my mindset and where I was at the time and where I think the profession should be going.
So you're in the midst of shifting this mindset, really looking at the people piece. Let's just throw it out there. In the midst of all that, we all get this thing called COVID-19 dropped on top of all of us. We've talked about it a lot on here. We probably talked about it when you were with us last time, but it was still fairly early during the pandemic. Talk about how you traverse that. So you're making this people shift, the ideology shift, and the words matter. You're dealing with the pandemic and how we're going to traverse that. What was the most impactful thing that you learned from that experience, and how's it made you a better practitioner and leader?
Yeah, you know, this was hard for me to answer because I don't know if I've actually taken time to think about it. So I thank you for making me think about it. You know, especially because the last 2 years, I think, have just been a blur for a lot of people. I just talked about, we talked 2 years ago on the podcast, and I blink and all of a sudden I'm talking to you again. But I think the most impactful lesson, I think people are both simultaneously strong and fragile. You know, we have these capabilities to weather these type of storms. We can be gracious and have humility, but at the exact same time succumb to the more basic urges of cave people nature. So I learned, or maybe re-realized, if that's even a word, that life happens. All of this has happened before. Nothing is truly unprecedented. It's not. It's just we haven't experienced it. Right. So it's learning from the past and just trying to be prepared to be better right now and hold off those basic urges. And then I also appreciate how you asked, how's COVID made me a better practitioner? I think it's been just trying to understand that despite my attempt to be humble in a lot of ways, I am a subject matter expert and people look to me for that expertise. And I had to accept this and just get comfortable with it. And that's okay. Understand it's not a bad thing to be a subject matter expert. That's the whole point of the diversity of labor, right, in our economy. So I've really grown to embrace that side of me, and it's helped, I think, a lot with my confidence and just how I approach being an HR practitioner. I know this now, so I just own it and help people make better decisions based on that.
You and I can agree that we are certainly not through the woods quite yet. I don't know if we're ever going to get there. Sometimes it feels like, but we're kind of on the other side of it, at least in theory. As we see people start to revert in some ways, maybe making choices or making moves that, let's just say it, maybe it's not quite popular, going back to the norm, for lack of a better word. What do you think, Paul's the biggest challenge we're going to see as practitioners over the next year? And how are you preparing yourself and your team for that?
I think you kind of alluded to it, honestly, in your lead up to it, but I think relationship management, and I'm not a big fan of the phrase labor relations. I think it's workplace relationships. To me, everybody is a laborer in a sense, right? From the CEO down, everybody is laboring. It's just a different kind of labor. So again, going back to words matter, I don't like the view of us versus them, zero-sum game that really has labor relations sort of, I think, embodies in a lot of things, or might come to your mind when you say that right away. There's a growing tension, or there had been a growing tension before COVID, honestly, and it's just been exasperated since, between management, frontline employees. You need to come and work in the office versus workplace flexibility, the tension between mask wearers and mask non-wearers, just the continued political dysfunction, however you want to define it. All these things impact the organization, right? And HR needs to figure out how to navigate and influence towards balance, in a lot of ways, desperately needed balance. So, and I'm not talking about going all Thanos on people and getting the Infinity Stones, right, for the snap. To me, it's really realizing and accepting that we're all part of the same whole. I mean, we're all connected. So when one of us is sick, all of us is sick. Organization, think of that. The root word of that is organism, right? A being. HR needs to figure out how to be the conduit for productive relationship building. Now, how I prepare my team for this is I just talk about it openly with them, and I try and lead by example. When one of my staff says something that catches my ear, I'll be like, why don't you take the rest of the day off, go spend it with family, try and figure out what you need to figure out, and then as long as the work gets done later on, I don't really care. This is helping you in the right now, and hopefully that can spread out throughout the organization.
You and I will have a labor relations conversation someday offline about the zero-sum game, because it is out there. It is interesting, the labor movement and the shift. I think, to your point, the last 2 years have only exacerbated a systemic issue for a lot of people, and it's very interesting to see who's going to be successful in the long run. Flexibility, whatever it may be. I don't know if your team is entirely remote or is allowed to be remote, or if you have the options for that, or, everybody's got to do what works best for them. But then you have to figure out what works best for the organization doesn't necessarily best work for that person. To me, that's one of the biggest things that I continue to see is that push-pull tug. And unfortunately, like I said, so many people thinking you got to come back. What are we gaining from that? Are we gaining what we think we're going to gain?
I agree with everything that you just said. And, there should be reasons behind these certain things, right? It's like, if you were getting the work done at home and it wasn't detrimental, but you're still making people come back to the office, you don't have much of a leg to stand on. And this is just my own personal view. I think COVID has just made me realize that people are bad at relationships, for what that's worth. And, I think it just boils down, just be a good person at the end of the day, and everything else will figure itself out. If you're a good person, people they'll trust you and they'll work with you, and they'll be more willing to accept what they otherwise would not accept. If you're a jerk, they're not going to accept what they weren't going to accept. So and there's no guarantees in any of it, but at least at the end of the day, relationship management just starts with being a good person. And that's what I hope people can start to get out of this.
Well, Paul, you were kind enough in the last year to raise your hand when we asked about co-hosting the Twitter chats, which we'll throw out again for those of you listening. We're always looking for co-hosts and people that have great topics. Paul, you came to us and said you wanted to talk about, coming from the HR philosopher standpoint, you exemplify that to me in all the conversations I have. And I always point to you and say, this is the guy you need to talk to when you're having these types of conversations. So I would say we had certainly, I believe, the most cerebral chat we ever had when we had yours. Talk to me a little bit about, what did you learn from that experience? And then a shameless plug to get people to check out the chat. What keeps you attending when you're not co-hosting?
I love that chat. And I was like, I'll just throw this out there and see if it sticks, kind of a thing. Because I did know it was related, but not fully related what people are used to with the HR chats, right? So I'm glad that you and Wendy took a leap of faith and allowed me to be a part of it. I think the biggest thing I learned was just how much work it actually is. You don't really think about it, but I mean, newfound respect for both of you. I think just trying to write engaging questions, posting the questions, but then you have to answer your own questions just to keep the conversation going. But then at the same time, you have to be engaging with people as they are also engaging. And then you have to reply to them, not just the, hey, how you doing? Thanks for coming. But you're retweeting or replying to something that they really made you think about. I think that hour went by in like 5 minutes because it was just total nonstop action. See what I did there? But
I did.
I just loved it. It was a great experience. And if anybody wants to raise your hand, reach out to John and Wendy and do it. But I keep coming back because y'all are my people. I value you and I value Wendy. I value the community. I love learning what other people have gone through as a way of hoping that either I can reproduce it or I can avoid it. There is wisdom in a lot of the folks that come to these Twitter chats. So that's what keeps me coming, just the connections. And I wish I could see the folks more often, but it is what it is. And this is our way of being able to connect with folks across the country.
With that, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. This episode of the HR Social Hour Half Hour podcast is brought to you by Namely. We all do our best to keep ahead of business trends, but keeping ahead can be its own full-time job. With everyone wearing multiple hats, it's easy to fall behind. That's why you need to make the switch to Namely, the all-in-one HR solution that adapts with your business. Namely helps you and your team with all aspects of HR, from onboarding and performance management to payroll and intuitive benefits enrollment. Whether you have 50 or 1,000 employees, all in one connected and modern platform. Plus, Namely is customizable for your company, culture, and goals, so they can match where you are now and adapt as you grow. Grow with Namely, and learn more about making the switch today by going to namely.com. For a limited time, get 1 month free when you make that switch to Namely. Thanks again to Namely for sponsoring the HR Social Hour Half Hour podcast. And now, back to the show. And welcome back. Now, Paul, we've gotten the HR talk out of the way, or maybe not. We may be having a little bit more here. We're going to talk professional wrestling. Many of you that have listened to the show or follow us on Twitter know we talk about these things. I got back into watching after many years being away from it during COVID, which I think a lot of people found new hobbies or different things. During that time, I got more and more involved, and I got really into it again, which I just didn't necessarily expect would happen. And then earlier this year with Twitter, because let's face it, there's a hashtag for everything. We created the hashtag HR Marks, where you, with the two of us and many of our peers, talk about this very subject. I'm going to show my age. I grew up watching territory wrestling, particularly Memphis, in the late 70s. How did you get started in your professional wrestling watching career?
Yeah, I'm showing my age a little bit, but not as much, I guess. But really late 80s. Not as much, but really it started in the late 80s, a little bit into the early 90s. What it really was, because it wasn't as big back then, and, pay-per-views and cable was still in its youth and all that, so you can't really watch a lot of it other than it was WWF Superstars of Wrestling. And I don't know if you remember that show, but it was every Saturday morning. That's really when I got started liking it. And then I go through ebbs and flows, I think, like you. What really cemented my love of wrestling hardcore was the Monday Night Wars in the late 90s that every wrestling fan knows. WCW versus WWF, and how that became less of a hobby at that point and like little kid interest to more of a, oh my God, this is great. I got to watch it all the time.
Now, a lot of people that are listening may poo-poo this whole thing. And we should be very clear. We are adults. We are well-educated individuals. We're productive members of society. We realize that it is predetermined. And we're going to talk, we're going to give some Wrestling 101 lingo here in a minute. I just want to make people aware that we know it's a show. It is a athletic event that is predetermined But wow, some of the athleticism and the performance level of these individuals that are part of this crazy world is something to behold. What was the draw for you, or what kept you watching from starting with the wars back in the 90s or getting back then? What keeps you watching now? Why are you so interested in this world?
Before I get into that, just real quick on what you said, I always laugh at that too, because if someone were to say, well, it's not real, right? Well, Bridgerton isn't real, right? That didn't really happen? What? It's like, duh. Of course I know. But why don't I hit you over the head with a steel chair and you tell me that it is not real?
I hate when people say it's fake.
Yeah.
There's a difference between fake and predetermined.
Yes.
And let's face it, you and I have not broken our bodies doing some of these amazing things that they were able to do, or the margin of error is so small. Talk about so often, they don't have stunt doubles. These are people doing this work often every night of the week or a lot.
It's performance art, it's taking a play and mixing it with gymnastics and creating a show out of it. And that's how I look at it. But what keeps me watching is I appreciate that art. I appreciate really good writing. I appreciate storylines and the physicality, because you and I were talking a little bit before this, but a wrestler recently at a recent event, Darby Allin, climbed a 20-foot ladder that was already in the ring that is 3 feet up and did a diving spin off onto a whole bunch of steel chairs. And we're just like, what is he doing? So I appreciate that people care enough to entertain us, and they have fun up to a point, as much as you can fun landing on steel chairs. And again, kind of like you, I've been kind of on and off over the last couple of decades. WWE used to be WWF. I just don't like the product and haven't liked their product in a couple decades. But I mean, just the writing and characters, and it's like, it doesn't captivate me. But what really reinvigorated me over the last couple of years was one, AEW, All Elite Wrestling. And to me, it's really returned to the quote unquote wrestling. It's not sports entertainment. So that's really what draws me back and keeps me coming is that love of wrestling and what at least me as a fan connect to.
Interestingly enough, on your HR Philosopher blog, you had written a post about wrestling and HR, and I found it. I don't think I ever told you this, but it said everything I'd ever want to say about my interest, and I don't want to say, I'm going to say it, my passion, my interest for this world. I have a hard time calling it sports entertainment. I prefer the more traditional wrestling. Again, predetermined. We all know that. You were so eloquent in explaining some things. What led you to write that blog to begin with?
Thanks for sharing that. That means a lot. And I appreciate you for doing that. I wrote that literally that night or the next morning or day after a recent AEW pay-per-view. It was AEW All Out. And it was one of the greatest pay-per-views I had ever seen. And that's not really hyperbole. It was almost perfect in just the way that the writing was perfect. The wrestling was perfect. All the storylines. I mean, and at this, wrestling fans will know, but, at this particular pay-per-view, this was CM Punk's in-ring return after 8 years hiatus. The Lucha Brothers defeated the Young Bucks, and both those names are big in the tag team circle. It was one of the best cage matches I'd ever seen. Kenny Omega, who is just always amazing. And then at AEW, Adam Cole and Bryan Danielson had showed up and shocked the crowd, and they had just defected from WWE over to AEW, and it just felt real again. It felt like late 90s, that feeling that I used to get. So I was just really riding that high at the time and marking out so hardcore. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to make HR connections to it. You know what, I didn't think it was that much of a stretch, so I'm just going to throw it out there and see what happens.
We're going to share a link to that blog in the show notes for people to check that out. We're going to do a little Wrestling 101 for folks that have never been around it at all or listening to us going, John, Paul, what are you guys talking about? These are some terms you're going to hear. You'll see them in Paul's blog, but you'll also hear them when you talk about wrestling. Paul, what's a babyface?
That's the good guy.
And then what's a heel?
It's the bad guy.
That's one of the beauties of these things. If simple storytelling, good and evil, right? Baby faces and heels. When they're creating these stories, then what's a work?
That's part of the story. It's anything that's planned to happen. So it's part of the act, part of the show.
And what's a shoot?
It's the opposite. That's anything that was not planned. It's a surprise. It's like, oh, crap.
Sometimes they work themselves into shoots, as it were.
And this is where it starts getting confusing because you have worked shoots, like the famous CM Punk pipe bomb. He did this big storyline where he was bashing WWF, and everyone was like, oh my God, how's he getting away with this? But everyone thought that he was going off script, but it was actually part of the script.
We should note, interestingly enough, from a human resources perspective, WWE, the wrestlers that perform with WWE are 1099 contractors. So when we apply HR logic to some of these, where you say, can you imagine somebody trash talking their employer? Their dynamic is very different than All Elite Wrestling. The performers there, wrestlers, are actually under contract, are W-2 employees. Very different dynamic. In wrestling over the years, it's been this you kind of go where the work is, and it's 1099. There's not insurance. And so when somebody falls and breaks their arm, WWE is smart enough to take care of those individuals. They wouldn't have to. It's really interesting. Probably aware of this. Andrew Yang, who ran for president, is a very staunch unionization proponent and was going after WWE. When he didn't get the presidential bid, he then, if you remember, he started trying to get the labor secretary job. And he was very clear about, I'm going after WWE, which got me excited because I figured I could go on Hostile Work Environment and be the HR person to talk about. And you could do it as well. But it's an interesting dynamic. That is where our world falls in, is that you've got these 1099 folks and how they're treated as opposed to the actual contracted W-2 employees, the AEW, those being the two big organizations out there right now.
Another, to tying it back to HR work, is workplace culture. And one of the reasons I'm a big proponent and just a big fan of AEW is, and I don't work there, so I don't know. You read these things and you try and read the tea leaves, but it seems overall a much more employee-friendly environment where employees at AEW, the wrestlers, have a lot more creative control. They have a lot more say in their jobs versus WWE. Whatever Vince McMahon says goes. And it doesn't matter unless your name is The Undertaker. Other than that, or Brock
Roman Reigns now.
And Roman Reigns now. Those are the big three. If you're those big three, you can do whatever you want. If you're not them, you do what Vince McMahon says. And to me, I would much rather work for a company like AEW.
You're watching a lot of AEW right now. You mentioned that you had a chance to I think you've attended at least a couple of TV tapings now, or one, and I know you've got one coming up that you're going to get to see that some of my friends are pretty jealous about.
I got to go to, I bought tickets to one. Unfortunately, there was a blizzard in Chicago,
right.
So I couldn't go. And I was disappointed, but I was going to bring my son, so that would have been his very first. He's only 7, so he doesn't have the attention span per se, but he likes it enough. At the end of June is AEW and New Japan Pro Wrestling. They're coming for a joint event in Chicago called The Forbidden Door. And for those unfamiliar with The Forbidden Door, it is sort of that gateway between wrestling promotions, and wrestling promotions don't promote one another, and especially Japan versus America. And Tony Khan's entire shtick is, let's break down the Forbidden Door. We're all wrestling fans. We should all work together. And so it's AEW and New Japan Pro Wrestling joint show. It's going to be so fun, I hope. And I know it will be.
And we should mention Tony Khan is the owner, CEO, promoter, head bottle washer for AEW. Started the promotion with some of the wrestlers there, but he is the money person behind that group. And it's interesting. I think just like this show, we try to be global. Professional wrestling is a global scale. People here primarily know WWE or WWF, and they may know AEW. One of my favorite things right now, and people that follow me on Twitter know I'm a huge fan of Stardom, which is a Japanese women's promotion that's under the same umbrella with New Japan Pro Wrestling. The thing I love about Stardom is that these ladies are incredibly well trained, and they put on a show. They know what they're doing. They obviously rehearse and perform together often. So, you mentioned some of the routines. It is a little more routine-y, than, if that's a word, than maybe some of the, than say catch wrestling, or, some of the British style wrestling is much more Greco-Roman, more amateur style. But Stardom is super fun. And as somebody that does not speak Japanese, I can watch them. I understand who the bad people are and who the good people are. They have these amazing battles where they are beat up. There's a term, stiff, and they work stiff. And a lot of the, so some employees can be a little brusque. That'd be working stiff, laying it in. Stardom is a very different thing. There's a comedic element to it that you may not see in other areas. But like I said, for me, it's been super fun to follow that. And like I said, don't speak Japanese, but I can at least understand good versus evil very clearly. And watching one person in particular shift from being a good lady and in a faction on a team that was considered good. Her team lost her in a match. She had to go to the other team. So over the next month, every time you saw her, she's the only wrestler in the promotion that wears a mask. And that mask started going from like My Little Pony colors, pinks and blues and yellows, started going to purples and blacks and dark blues. And she became a heel. She now wears all black and purples, and the masks are always ornate. Starlight Kid, one of my favorites, because it's just watching her style of wrestling change. And she does bad things now, and hits people other ways and pokes them in the eye. I love this stuff, Paul, and so do you. That's what's so much fun about this. This may be hard in all your time watching. What's a favorite match or a storyline that you have? Something you'd recommend to somebody that maybe isn't familiar with the product at all?
Yeah, this was hard because there's just so many breadths of decades of watching this stuff. But how can you go wrong with the legendary Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Mr. McMahon storyline? I mean, it transcends wrestling. I mean, for those unfamiliar with it, Stone Cold Steve Austin was this stiff, for lack of a better word, employee. And big bad Mr. McMahon, he wasn't doing what he was supposed to. So they worked into the storyline to where he was always beating up Mr. McMahon and they were going after each other. And who hasn't had a boss at one time that you just wanted to flip him the bird and pour beer on him, give him a stunner or something? It just connected to the regular working Joe or Joette, I mean, I just had a hard time trying to figure out what did I like better than that? And I'm sure there might be something, but that is just top of mind.
I had a pair of matches that go together, and to me, it's the two best matches of the last several years. Walter and Ilia Dragonoff. Walter is a Viennese wrestler. He's 6'4". At the time, he was well over 300, and he's just a brute. He's like a beer barrel beer barrel chested, just a big hands, big dude. Ilia Dragonoff is Russian. He's 5'10" and weighs maybe 200. These guys put on a show. Their first match was in October of 2020, and you can watch these on Peacock if you have that, or if you're overseas and you have the WWE Network, you can watch it. It's on the NXT UK program from October 2020. Walter Ilia was one of the most amazing things I've seen, and of course, it was without an audience. It was simply the wrestlers and the referee there and the camera crew. They put on just an incredible show. Walter is stiff. His big hands, and when he smacks somebody on the chest, it resonates, and man, it leaves marks. And Ilia, even at his size, left marks on Walter. I am much more of a fan of the in-the-ring beat-em-ups, as it were. Mm-hmm. I appreciate high flying, but I really like that mat-dominated technical style wrestling, and that's what these guys did. So they have this amazing match. Everybody says, tremendous for what it is. For those people like me, that one of the best things they've seen in a long time. August of 21 for the NXT takeover here in the United States. Walter had been the champion for 500 or 800 days, something like that. Long time. They build this whole storyline, and here's this little Russian, right? The 5'10", 200-pound guy against the big Viennese Austrian monster. Paul, I'm telling you, that match was in front of an audience, and people went bananas. You did not know who was going to win. It was competitive. It was snug and stiff again. They were beating each other up. And like David versus Goliath, which people love a good versus evil story, Ilia Dragonoff wins the title, pins Walter 1, 2, 3, and the last shot is this little guy compared to the big guy holding the belt over, up over his head with his foot on Walter's chest. Fantastic storytelling. I just love it. Walter versus Ilya Dragonoff. Either one of those matches, particularly if you want to see what I would consider more traditional style wrestling, mat-based, technical, you can't beat it. Some of the best stuff out there.
No, thanks for that. I kind of always, at least now, I always forget about NXT. But there was a while where NXT was just probably the best.
Yeah.
It was better, at least in my opinion, than in a lot of my friends' opinions who are wrestling fans. NXT was superior to WWE. And for a comparison's sake, let's say WWE is the major leagues. NXT was the minor leagues.
Well, now it's the time everybody was waiting for, and it's not the question connection. We're going to go through our top 5 lists, and this is a cumulative of all of our experience watching professional wrestling. We're going to share our top 5 performers. We want to put a caveat out there, and Paul and I talked a little bit about this before we got started. Being the HR philosopher, I said, hey, this is something we need to think about. We want to separate the art from the artist in these cases. Some of these people are not necessarily good people. Maybe they can redeem themselves, maybe not. We want to talk about performance in the ring, as working the microphone, as a speaker, as a performer. Just please keep that in mind, because we know some of them they make poor choices in life. And like many of us make poor choices, they make them, and unfortunately they're very public.
Yeah, I think it's important, John, to, because I struggle with this too. It's like, how do you root on somebody or get invested in when they make these very human errors? But then that's why I remind myself, they are human just like us. They're not superheroes. They're not Greek gods and goddesses and all those type of things. They are fallible. Now, it doesn't mean we don't hold them accountable, right? But you separate the art from the artist, and you can appreciate the in-ring and the kayfabe stuff versus the real world and real consequence stuff within reason, right? So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, starting out, what's your number 5?
This one was the hardest one because there's always a whole bunch of people, but I did Chris Jericho just because I've been watching him. I mean, he's been in it for 30 plus years, and the dude is still reinventing himself, and he's just still one of the most, I think, impressive mic skills, and I think the reinventing himself, sort of like Madonna. It's like he just doesn't go away and gets better over time somehow.
Has a good podcast too.
Yeah, and he loves rock and heavy metal, and so I'm like, hey, I can connect with that.
My number 5 is probably the person that made me put that caveat there about not necessarily making great choices as a human being. My number 5 is Ric Flair. The man put on a show over the years from very early on in the AWA and NWA in the 80s, well before he ever became associated with WWF, WWE, or even after that with TNA, and then coming back to WWE to end his career. On the microphone is as good as anyone, if not better. One of the ultimate heels. Man, just did it like nobody else. His in-ring style to be able to wrestle an hour a night with the likes of Ricky Steamboat, who is also just a phenomenal wrestler and athlete, to do that literally night after night after night, 300 nights a year, it is a real testament. He's a lot of things, and he wears fancy Rolexes and nice suits. Ric Flair, number 5. All right, how about your number 4?
Number 4 to me was the bad guy, Razor Ramon. And he's probably my favorite when I was a little kid, just because he was different. And the dude just had a look. It's hard to explain, but just this Cuban that just shows up, just says, hey, yo, toothpick, not a whole lot of talking, and just beat you in the ring. He was a good guy through the bad guyness of it, if that even makes sense. But he was just awesome to watch. And one of my favorite matches was WrestleMania 10, him and Shawn Michaels in the first ever ladder match, which just is epic. And he ended up winning it.
Scott Hall, who was Razor Ramon, very influential throughout his career, not just as a wrestler, but behind the scenes and doing different things. You had mentioned before we started recording, I mean, there's a redemption story with Scott Hall that's quite powerful and was positive. He recently passed away. The goodwill that came out after that and the outpouring of love from throughout that community was really nice to see.
Yeah, he had a lot of demons, and I think it was he was the human story. Just like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, we're all capable of good things, and we're all capable of bad things. And he did some bad things when his demons got a hold of him, but then he did redeem himself later in life and tried giving back to the community, the wrestling community, that is.
My number 4 will probably not come as a shock to anybody that follows me at all on Twitter. My number 4 is Asuka. I love Asuka. I'm an unabashed mark for Asuka. She is a Japanese wrestler who has been around for many, many years. I think her rookie year was, she's been almost 20 years in the industry. So we're talking early 2000s that she started, actually took a break for some health issues, had a child, which is one of those things that they keep a big secret of, but it's not secret necessarily, but had a child and then came back, was a performer in Japan for many, many years, wrestled alongside Kenny Omega, who, as a tag team. Intergender wrestling, particularly in Japan, is fascinating because we don't see it a lot here. And it's not something, every once in a while you might see a mixed tag match, but you're not going to see a woman versus a man in the ring at the same time. That is not uncommon there. When she was then known as Kana, so Kana went through the ranks of Japan and came to NXT, WWE, back in 2016, 2017, was the NXT Women's Champion for 510 days and just beat everybody. It was awesome. She had this tear because she's a badass. And I just have the utmost respect for Asuka as a wrestler, as a business person. She's incredibly business-minded. She has a background in graphic design, has a YouTube channel with a huge following, does a lot of video game stuff and worked in video games, owns a hair salon. She's awesome. And I love her. Asuka was my number 4.
Hard to argue.
How about your number 3?
This one is Bryan Danielson. He holds a special place in my wrestling heart because at the time I wasn't into wrestling, like mid 2000 teens. I don't even know what you call those. The aughts were before, but anyway. And he was wrestling in WWE at the time as Daniel Bryan. He was this smaller guy, high flying, super technical in the ring. And William Regal calls him probably the greatest pure wrestler he's ever seen, which is saying something because William Regal was really, really good at his technicality stuff. He was not the guy Vince McMahon usually likes to push, right? Vince McMahon likes big dudes that are just giant and bigger than life. Danielson was just a regular guy and made it to where what was eventually the storyline was forced on WWE. They didn't want to do this, but that just showed how powerful he was at the time and how over he was with the crowd, that they forced what was called the yes movement, which was his catchphrase. He said, yes, yes, yes. Became WWE champion after having to go through all these hoops. And it had a lot of that early Stone Cold versus Vince McMahon feel to it. And it got me back into wrestling, at least for a little while, with WWE in the mid 2000 teens. And got to go to WrestleMania 30 in New Orleans to see him do that.
Nice.
That was a trip of a lifetime.
Wow.
It was in New Orleans, all these wrestling nerds taking over the French Quarter, and I got to see live NXT at the WWE convention before WrestleMania, and then WrestleMania was just one of the coolest experiences ever to see Bryan Danielson. Now he's in AEW and doing some really awesome work there with William Regal in what's called the Blackpool Combat Club. The whole storyline there is teaching young wrestlers how to be wrestlers. So they've taken Wheeler Yuta under his wing, and Wheeler Yuta is just a badass, and they're really pushing him and making him shine. And that's just Bryan Danielson just giving back. That's why I have him up there on my list.
Great choice. He is a hell of a performer for sure. My number 3 is Macho Man Randy Savage.
Oh, yeah.
October 1986. I am in middle school, and I can recall Macho Man jumping off the top rope with the ring bell and hitting Ricky the Dragon Steamboat in the throat and crushing his windpipe. I'm a middle schooler. Like, I should know this by now. It's predetermined because Ricky had to go off and have surgery on something else, so they crushed his larynx and he couldn't talk. But Macho Man, his look, his voice, He had Miss Elizabeth, who I had a huge crush on. She was just adorable. Macho Man was such a great performer. He was one of those people that didn't need to wear a belt, didn't have to have a championship to be a star. His match with Steamboat from WrestleMania is one for the books. It's interesting, though, because the more you learn about these things, the more you've determined that entire match was scripted out. They knew every move verbatim, and they would recite to each other. He was very specific in detail and wanted everything mapped out. He was Bonesaw in the Spider-Man movie. He's the Slim Jim guy, for crying out loud. Macho Man, unfortunately, lost Macho Man in an auto accident many years ago now. One of those people that behind the scenes did so much good for his community, was very active in helping, especially children's charities and things. There will never be another Macho Man.
Yeah. No, great choice.
You're number 2.
Hope this doesn't come across as just sort of like a gimme one, but I think given the context of when I grew up and everything, and the greater cultural thing, it's The Rock. Whatever it is, the dude has it in spades. Nobody, in my generation, we have a little bit between, but other than maybe Ric Flair, but nobody was better on the mic than The Rock. And it was just natural. Wrestling, just like everything, changes over time. And during the Attitude Era, when The Rock came up and was doing his stuff, there were scripts, but you didn't have to follow the script per se. You were given a little bit more freedom. And The Rock didn't need a script. He would just go off of and make every promo that he would give the best that you've ever seen. And it was just all natural. And every single catchphrase he did, outstanding. But then his in-ring work just kept getting better and better and better, as it should. And some of the best matches I've ever seen were with The Rock, because he just knows how to tell a story. He knows when to sell. He knows just what to do and when to do it. So, and obviously ever since, he's become a cultural phenomenon that's gone way beyond wrestling. And he's more successful now than he ever would have been if he stayed in wrestling. The Rock.
I cannot fault that choice. And I can remember watching him on his first Saturday Night Live appearance thinking, this guy's got it. That was when for me, it was, wait a minute, he's not going to be a wrestler forever. He's got something, you could tell then, that charm, that charisma. He was funny. It seemed effortless. I know other people aspire to be him in that world because, let's face it, he really, he is. There are people now that probably don't know he was ever a professional wrestler.
No,
you're young enough, you might know him as the voice in the guy in Moana or something. You're not going to know him as The Rock.
That's funny that you say it. Yeah, no, that's true. And I never really thought of it like that, but you're probably right. And I think that just shows how how much he's just transcended what this is.
My number 2 is throwback to growing up watching in the 70s in Memphis wrestling, and it's Jerry Lawler. The king of Memphis, the king of wrestling. I had an opportunity to meet him right before COVID. I'd had a negative experience I'll just say it, I had a negative experience with Gilbert Gottfried, rest in peace. Mm-hmm. But my experience with Gilbert was just not positive at all. I think now, maybe knowing of his illness now, maybe that was part of it. I was like, oh man, I met this guy and that kind of sucked. And then was going to meet Lawler the next day. And I walked up to Lawler and I said, Mr. Lawler, I've been a fan since the late 70s when I watched you with my grandmother on Channel 3 in Louisville. And he looked up and he said, that was a long time ago. And I said, yes, sir, it was. And we talked for about 5 minutes. Jerry Lawler is also a very accomplished artist. Went to college on an art scholarship, got into wrestling because he drew drawings of the wrestlers in Memphis. And that's how he got his start. But he still draws, and he'll go to comic book conventions and draw wrestlers, superheroes. He's big. He owns a Batmobile. Come on, how can I not like a guy who owns a 66 Batmobile, no less. But anyway, Jerry Lawler, if you go back and if you ever are interested in territory wrestling, watch that stuff from Memphis. He was the co-owner of the territory, which is part of the reason he was a heel and a face over the years. He played both parts, but way before he got to WWE and was an announcer and looking at the ladies, he was an amazing performer, and he threw fire at people. Like, come on, can't beat that stuff. We don't see that. Asuka spits the green mist. Maybe that's why I like her too. I like anybody that's got some kind of paraphernalia.
Yeah, it's funny. My experience with the King is mostly as the ring announcer. So knew him as the heel counterpart to good old JR, Jim Ross. So I didn't know him as a wrestler per se. So I would have to go back and YouTube a lot of his stuff. But I know enough of him legendary.
There's ample stuff. And what's fun is watching him with a then 17, 18, 19-year-old Jeff Jarrett, because he owned the territory with Jarrett's dad. Funny how all that world works. We've covered a bunch of people quick. I got to know now. I've heard Rock. I've heard a couple names. Number one.
Should come as probably a very little surprise, but it's Stone Cold Steve Austin. I mean, the dude, when you're a teenager going through puberty and you got all these hormones hopping you up and all that stuff. I mean, Stone Cold was it was just a perfect storm. The dude had the attitude that you wanted to be. You were rebellious at 13, 14, 15. He was living the dream. He was beer swilling, just cussing, mud hole stomping dude. And it was just like, man, I hate my boss at Kmart. I want to Stone Cold stun him and slam some brewskis down. It was just like, and come on, he had the most iconic wrestling t-shirt of all time. Just simple Austin 316 with the smoking skull on the back. And when I wore that shirt, I felt like a badass, even though I wasn't. It's Stone Cold Steve Austin all day.
I think Stone Cold's another interesting one in that his in-ring career is fairly limited. He up until this last WrestleMania, which I'm assuming you watched it, that part of it, man, his return was about as good as it could be. And then when he came back Sunday night was hilarious for the second night. The thing I really appreciate about Stone Cold, and I would have never imagined this having watched him when he was at his height as a wrestler, he's a really good interviewer. His show, the Stone Cold Sessions, his podcast was good, but I really like the show he's doing for WWE now on Peacock, Smoking Skull Sessions. He's just a great interviewer, and I love he's just no nonsense about it all. I really enjoy listening to him talk to other wrestlers about their careers. He gets it because he's done it.
A lot of wrestlers, they try and work, the gimmick. They try and do these things to create the character. Stone Cold was Stone Cold. That was his character. I mean, and to be able to get to play yourself to such a degree, I think just kind of speaks to how talented he really was. And you're right. If it wasn't for that unfortunate, he broke his neck with Owen Hart, a botch pile driver, that cut his career down by at least a decade, if not more. But, when he was in the ring during the height of the Attitude Era and even a little bit beyond that, I mean, there was no one better.
My number one is Roddy Piper. MJF, who's a current wrestler, Maxwell Jacob Friedman, who I think has the potential to be the greatest performer of his generation. He's currently with AEW. MJF talks about how much he watches Piper even now. And you can see a lot of how Piper was a heel. He was always he was a great heel. I love the fact that he never liked Hogan in real life. He never took a pin from Hogan in WWF. He didn't care about the money. He's like, I'm not doing this. Like, I'm going to do it the way I did. He's another one of these guys that didn't have to wear a championship title to draw a crowd. People hated Piper. And Piper was a kid from Canada. He was an orphan, legit orphan in Canada who was in a pipe group. And so his shtick when he started was playing the bagpipes. He literally, with a bunch of other wrestlers, got in a car and they snuck him across the border. And that's how he got started wrestling in the U.S. Piper had a great podcast. You can't find it anymore. You can find a handful of episodes still, but it was the Piper's Pit, just like his TV show, his show within the show on WWE. I mean, let's face it, he hit a coconut over another guy's head on his talk show. I mean, he put Andre and Hulk together before WrestleMania, and that whole bit happened in the Piper's Pit. He was just part of so many things. He's in They Live. He has one of the greatest lines in an action movie of all time about bubblegum and kicking ass. But my favorite thing about Roddy Piper, besides just the fact he was awesome and wore a kilt and did these things, he is one of 3 people, real people, to be in G.I. Joe. You had Sergeant Slaughter. Everybody knew Slaughter's Marauders. As a Chicago person, you would appreciate if you didn't know, William the Refrigerator Perry has a G.I. Joe action figure. But Roddy Piper was the athletic trainer for Destro's group, the Iron Grenadiers. And so I actually have a sketch of Roddy Piper, Iron Grenadiers t-shirt with a kilt on, jumping over Cobra soldiers how to train them. Roddy Piper, I loved that guy. I was so upset when he passed. Not a flawless individual. He had his issues, but he was also very open about them. And I appreciated that about him. You can watch all his stuff you can watch a lot of his stuff on Peacock, particularly notice the talk show stuff with Heenan. It's gold, man. It's absolute gold. Can't recommend it enough.
It's great. And you bring up MJF and Piper. I think it was with Piper where I first started realizing, and maybe a little bit of Triple H, but you're right, when you were little or younger and not what they call a smart mark or whatever you want to call it, you didn't really get it. You hated them. And then you realize if you hated them, they were doing their job better than anybody else.
That's right.
And you're like, okay, I get it. And that's where it started to turn and you started appreciating like Roddy Piper for just his talent and what he was able to do.
Paul, we have gone well past a half hour, which is just fine because it's our show and we can. I can't thank you enough for saying yes to making time on a weekend to get together, to catch up and talk a little shop, but talk even something more about something I know that, again, we both appreciate so much. I'm hoping that some of the listeners that are still with us have learned something maybe today, or we'll go check some of this stuff out. Or if you're into professional wrestling and you didn't know that we talk about it on there, check out the HR Marks hashtag on Twitter. But, again, I'm glad we're here. I know most of our listeners are probably connected with you, but if they're not, best way for them to reach you out there.
You can find me on LinkedIn. Just go, type in my name, and then on Twitter, HRPaul49. And of course, you can find me on my blog at hrphilosopher.com. Of course, you can find me on Twitter every second and fourth Sunday, HR Social Hour. You can find that at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. How about you, John? How can people find you?
Well, first off, thanks to Namely for sponsoring this episode. They may be a little surprised at what they get this time, but thank you for being part of this. As for me, JohnThurman.com for all things John Thurman, for the show, HR Social Hour Podcast.podbean.com. Listen, rate, review, share, follow. And if you've reached it this far, we know you're doing that and we appreciate it. International listeners, particularly if you're into professional wrestling, get in touch because I'd love to talk about whatever they do where you are. And Paul would too. We love this stuff. Reach out because it's easier for you to get in touch with us than for us to get in touch with you. And we'd love to have those conversations. So, Paul, again, I appreciate being with me. I know you've listened to this for a while. So do you think you can help me with the close?
Oh, give me a hell yeah, John. Honored to.
Well, then, so for the HR Social Hour Half Hour Podcast, I'm John.
And I'm Paul. And as always, be sure to connect,
give back, and network. Take care, everybody.
And that's the bottom line because John and Paul said so.